Hi, I'm Rebecca Mercuri. Some of you may have heard my name. I'm someone who's been interested in election systems since 1989. I've been doing research on voting systems since that time. Probably can find out a lot about me through the web. If you see the end of the talk, I'll be speaking for a half hour, and at the end of the talk, there'll be some links that you can go to. There's also a flyer on some of your tables that's sort of a press release with a New York Times article on the back. Feel free to take a copy of that, and that explains a little bit about what's going on. So today I'm here to talk about managing election data, and in particular, I want to talk about my analysis of the California recall election. You may recall, last fall when they had that election, it was fairly controversial. It was controversial in a number of regards, and then following the election, the analysis of data came out. There was a couple of independents, such as myself, who were dumping down the data from the Secretary of State's website, and then we were providing our analysis to organizations like the Associated Press, where it was subsequently misquoted and used in a variety of dastardly, that's a new word, dastardly ways, in which it has still been continuing to propagate. Just the other week, just actually a few days ago, I saw it misquoted again, and this information has been misused in a variety of ways that I will explain, and there is an agenda afoot as to how this data is being misrepresented by the major press organizations as well as by vendors and election officials around the country and even, in fact, around the globe. So it turns out that this is important data. It's important data because it has an important result or an important set of results, but it also is important because once you have something that's very interesting, people tend to use it for their own purposes and then misuse it. And so that's important too, because watching it propagate in this erroneous fashion lets us know sort of what's out there and what we're up against. In any event, so I'm going to be speaking for about a half hour, and then Bev Harris is going to speak, and then we'll take Q&A, so it should be an interesting session. Let me give you a little bit of history about California recalls. They actually do this quite a bit. They've never done it for the governor before last year. That was the first time they ever did that. There's usually a lot of attempts to do this, to recall the state elected officials, but only 8 actually have been successful in proceeding to ballot, and of those, only 5 were actually successful. So California has a long history of this, but not a tremendously successful. It's sort of more like a gnat, sort of a nuisance type of thing, but that's basically what they do out there. These are the types of machines, the types of voting machines that were used in the recall. Most of the information that I've given you here is on the Secretary of State's website. I'd be happy to provide this data for you if you need it for any particular purposes, so feel free to contact me. But basically what you can see there is that they were using a variety of different machines. Different counties were using different types of machines, and the punch cards, which a lot of people were trying to get rid of after the 2000 election, thinking that they were really bad and had all sorts of problems with them. It's not necessarily the case, but they were trying to get rid of them. Those were still actually being used. So if you look at the light blue ones, those are the data vote punch cards. And the data vote punch card is a very interesting type of punch card where the CHAD is actually sucked out by the voting system. So there's no hanging CHAD, or there's very little of it because it's sort of a CHAD sucking machine. And interesting results with regard to that. And then if you look at the dark blue, there's 7 counties that was using that, including the very populous Los Angeles. And Los Angeles that's a huge amount of voters, almost 2 million voters down there. And they were trying to actually get rid of the punch cards prior to the election. They were using the infamous vote-o-matic punch cards with the hanging CHAD. And there was also issues and questions as to whether it would be fair to allow them to use this in this very important recall election. So as you imagine, lawsuits ensued and that sort of stuff. The 4 counties in orange are the ones that are using touchscreens. And we like to refer to them as unauditable voting systems. They do not have any way of doing an independent recount of the ballots that were cast. You can get a reprint of totals that you seem to see out of the voting machine at the end of the election day. But there really is no way to do an independent audit of that, devoid from the equipment, machinery, and software that's provided by the vendor. So the 4 counties in orange were the ones that we had some concern about. Strangely enough, there's even hand-counted paper ballots in some places, and, but just in 1 county. And then most of the counties, 34 of the counties, were using the optically scanned ballots, which are similar to doing sort of SAT type of test type of thing. So what we had was UC Berkeley, who originated the Vote-O-Matic. As it turns out, they invented the Vote-O-Matic back in, I have no idea when, I used to know that date, but in any event, they invented this and subjected a large percentage of the country to these Chad-hanging voting machines. And now at UC Berkeley, they have a professor by the name of Henry Brady, who makes it his business to go around when he's called to testify to say that these machines are bad. So I think it's sort of rather interesting that UC Berkeley has given us both ends of the spectrum. And he's been testifying largely in behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union in California. And recently there's an Ohio lawsuit that's been lodged by the ACLU. And they seem to think that if minorities, in other words, precincts that have these vote-o-matic machines are generally not as wealthy populations in those areas, and if minorities use these machines, despite the fact that they've been used for many decades, that their votes are going to be lost at some sort of higher rate than using any other type of voting machine, in particular, extremely expensive newfangled computers. So that's the claim that they make. This is unsupported by fact, but they do make this claim, and Henry Brady goes around. He has a number of testimonies that are up on the web with fallacious arguments. I've submitted my comments to him. He actually called me one day. I sent him an email with multiple pages of comments to which he has never replied. So I find it very interesting that this is what's going on. I should tell you the ACLU, if you are a card-carrying member, it's not entirely bad. If you're a member of the ACLU in Florida, they actually are opposed to these types of machines down there. So the ACLU has its own sort of weird way of doing things and deciding what is good and what is bad. But in California, the ACLU represented Common Cause, the Southwest Voter Registration Project, and the California NAACP. Now, the NAACP, for a while, due to very bad advice that they were getting, was thinking that these fully electronic machines that provide no independent audit were the best things in sliced bread, and that we need to get rid of these chat-hanging equipment and do the touch screens. So for some reason, the NAACP had been convinced of this. They have now since changed their opinion, and the national NAACP now realizes the folly of their ways, and they are actually trying to do something different and talk about the voter-verified paper ballot, which I won't really get into. But in any event, experts Roy Saltman, who had originally in 1984 worked for what was then now became the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, wrote one of the original reports on this subject in the early 80s, saying that this unauditable equipment was bad. He, for some reason, has sort of changed his tune, and he and Henry Brady claimed that the residual vote rate for punch cards would unequally disenfranchise about 46% of the voters, primarily in the urban counties, and including the 1.9 million in Los Angeles. So what they were arguing was under the constitutional 14th Amendment and the United States Voting Rights Act of 1973 protections, that this was not equal access and that there was not equal opportunity to cast your ballot and have it be recorded and read correctly. U.S. District Court Judge Wilson, in his infinite wisdom, decided that this was a bogus argument and did not feel satisfied with it. He felt that there would be much more difficulties that would occur if they put off the recall election. As you remember, over the summer, last summer, people were, is the election on, is the election off? It kept going back and forth. And so ultimately what happened was that the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court, 3-judge panel, upheld the lower court decision claiming that the constitutional and federal rights would not be violated by using hanging chad in some of the counties. So this is an important decision, and it allowed the election to proceed. So the election proceeded, and this data that we've been concerned about is what we characterize as the residual vote rate, and this is the only math in my talk. fairly straightforward formula. If you think about it as, let's say you have the opportunity to vote yes or no, like in the California recall. There were two things, actually there are four things on the ballot, but there were two things that pertained to the recall. There was a yes and no question, and then there was, do you want Arnold Schwarzenegger to be the next governor sort of question. Okay, so there was these two things that you got to deal with. So in the yes and no question, you could vote yes or no, or you could not vote for either thing. Now, there is a theory among election officials that people, even when there was a one race on the ticket, that it's just yes or no, or pick one person, that people, by the thousands, by maybe the tens and hundreds of thousands, and overall, by the millions, walk into the polls and don't pick one of these things. I find this hard to believe. Maybe it is the case, but I find it really hard to believe. So actually, the Sun Sentinel in Florida ran a study on exactly this. This is what we call the residual vote. The residual vote is how many votes were not recorded for any of the choices in that particular thing. Now, you can maybe imagine if you had multiple things to do, like 3 or 4 things to do, you might not want to vote for one of the things. But if there's only one thing to choose among, why would you bother going into the polls to even bother if you didn't intend to vote? But we have been told, even in court, that there are a lot of people that like to exercise that option. I think it's ridiculous, but that's okay. That's their opinion, and I have mine. But in any event, that's the metric that we're dealing with, because unfortunately, we don't have a none of the above. We should strangulate people and force them to stay in the polls until they actually choose the yes or the no. But unfortunately, we don't have a none of the above choice, which allows them to prove that they really didn't want to vote for anything and then allow them to leave. So we have this thing called the residual vote. And it's not an appropriate metric. So we're talking about a bogus metric to begin with. That's why we're sort of in the session on doing data analysis, because it could be a deliberate skip by the voter if we believe that theory, which we call an undervote. They have deliberately chosen that. Or the voter could be completely confused. They walk in, they're somewhat amazed by the whole voting situation. Their instructions were bad. They might have voted for two things. They might have voted for yes and no, and that's called an overvote. So that's, again, confusion there. Or what I believe, there could be equipment malfunction or some sort of defect. As it turns out, the ballot scanning ones, the ones that did the optical scanned ones, in California, weren't recognizing gel ink pens. So if you happen to come in, they don't give you a pen. You just sort of pull your own pen out of your pocket. And if you happen to use a gel ink pen, it was just not counting those votes. So this, in my opinion, is an equipment malfunction, some sort of defect. Chad, if you punch through the Chad didn't come off, then that could be you could consider that an equipment malfunction. We also have ballot box tampering. The people believe that people take these Chad hanging cards and then punch extra holes in them, thus voiding those ballots, making them overvotes, or stuffing Chad back in. I mean, all sorts of weird things that you do, or just swapping cards. And then we have what we're calling these fleeing voters, people who come in, just completely can't deal with it and then leave. I actually have to tell you, I worked as a poll worker for close to 20 years, like 10 years in Pennsylvania and then another 10 years in New Jersey. And only in one time did I ever see a voter actually flee prior to casting their ballot. It's very strange. So, but in any event, they say this is happening in massive droves of numbers. What we know is that when we compare all equipment, actually there's always undervotes. Sometimes there's more votes than there are the numbers of people who actually signed the book to say that they were going to be voting at the election. But that's really rare, and in those cases, we know that something weird definitely did go on. Shouldn't be more, but usually the numbers never add up to 100%. Typically, the number is around 3 to 5% residual vote rate for most elections, irrespective of the equipment that's used. So that's the metric that I'm dealing with. I agree it is a flawed metric, but unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with. So we do have to use that data. So here's the data that we collected. Of the eligible voters, 21.8 million, 43% actually did go and vote. Of the number registered, though, only 15.3 million are registered, and of that, 61% voted. California has, interesting absentee ballot laws, and so you can declare yourself a permanent absentee voter in California, and so a lot of people do that because they just don't want to go to the polls for whatever reasons, and about 30% of the vote cast was absentee. So even though we're counting these numbers, we really don't know. It's never separated out into the actual equipment and the ones that were counted by absentee. It's all glomped together. They don't give us good breakouts. So that sort of corrupts our data too. So we have to assume that there could be some skew, because even in the ones that were using touchscreens, 30% of the people approximately were also using paper ballots. So anyway, so there's other issues with regard to that. So how were these vote totals reported? Within minutes. Now, I'm out on the East Coast, okay? So I'm on the East Coast, and it's like 8:05, okay, on, your time, or in, West Coast time. So on the 11 o'clock news, they're reporting that Schwarzenegger won. Now, how is that possible? It's not at all possible. What I believe they did was California law allows them to start processing the absentee ballots as early as 7 days prior to the election. They're not allowed to release those totals until 8 p.m. on election day. So my belief is that they started processing the absentee ballots, went through election day, maybe they even had them done before election day actually occurred, but at 8 p.m., the numbers, the estimates that they released, I believe, were the absentee ballot totals. No way to really know. They were giving those as estimates, exit polling estimates, which we never have any evidence that exit polling is actually really done, but that's another story. But in any event, that's how I believe they came up with these results. There were some 2.2 million absentee ballots that were turned in prior to election day throughout the state, representing that percentage of some 3.2 million that were distributed. Now, as I was watching this, so one of the great things I love to do on election day or election night and into the morning of the next day is start watching these returns come in on the internet. And they change hour by hour. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. It's all sorts of really strange things. We're not talking percentages, we're talking number of votes. How come a place had 1 million votes counted and now they have 800,000 votes counted? Very strange. But in any event, I like to watch these things and I sort of record these as the day goes along. And what happened was that Alameda had some problems scanning their absentee ballots, so they wound up reporting very late. The totals weren't really done until around 4 o'clock, something like that, on the next day. And the state law actually requires a 1% manual recount following the election. So they have to take these piles of ballots. Of course, with the electronic machines, all they do is press a button and out comes another piece of paper with the total on it. But in other places, they do actually, I was invited by Connie McCormack, who really doesn't like me terribly much, but she invited me to come to Los Angeles, and unfortunately I didn't have the time to do that, and actually watch them take these ballots and actually hand recount them. Now, they never tell you what they're going to do if the numbers differ from the number on the computer. One assumes that they make a correction, but that's done sort of a week or so later. So the totals that I was using were the official totals that were reported by the Secretary of State. My original estimates were from those election day reporting results, and then I have corrected them. So the totals you're going to see here are the ones from the corrected totals, who knows what, but whatever, something, whatever was posted as the official results by the California Secretary of State. Now, what's very, very interesting is that due to Bev Harris here, in large part, it was subsequently revealed that all of the counties that were using Diebold vote casting and counting equipment, this is including, thank you very much, this is including the touchscreen machines as well as the optically scanned machines, they had used state and federally uncertified software. So there's a complete screw up there on the part of the vendor. Whether it was deliberate, we don't really know. But basically what happened was that there was equipment that really was not set up the appropriate way. Lots of other things, as you can see, as far as security controls, we're not going to get into that. Let me get into the data, because I'm running out of time here. There was 4 things on the ballot. There were 2 propositions, and then there was the recall question, yes or no, and then the gubernatorial choice. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger did win, but Arnold Schwarzenegger only got 48.6% of the vote. So the majority did not vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger. But in any event, the recall did pass with a majority, with a numeric majority, 55.4% yes, 44.6% no. Okay, so that was the results as certified by the official statement of vote report. You can get that off of the Secretary of State's website, saying that the following is a full, true, and correct statement of the result of the official canvass of the returns, the October 7, 2003 statewide special election. Dun, 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 dun. And here is his chart that he gave showing the counties that voted yes, and the counties that voted no. Very interesting. The counties that voted no included Los Angeles. So it's sort of interesting. But you notice that all you see here, and this is his official results, all you see here is yes versus no. Everything nicely adds up to 100%. But here's the real data. This is what I call the fishy statistics. Remember, this is from the official report. You notice that the total number of votes is not the same in each of the four things. You would think that if there were 9.4 million voters, that there would be the exact same number of voters voting in all of the ballots. How come in Proposition 53, there's 9413479, and in 54, there's 2 more people who voted? And then there's less people who voted in the recall, and there's, the numbers do not add. This is the ones on the total column. They don't add up. But the governor and the secretary of state or whatever, they never explain this. Why aren't these numbers the same? Now, you also notice that what he reported as the official results are the yes and no, but he didn't report the not cast. Look at the not cast. 11.4% of the people who voted, well, we're assuming out of the total, so I had to use the different totals. I mean, they are only off by a few, but they should be exactly the same. I don't understand why they're not exactly the same. Whatever. So if you look at the not cast, 11.4% of the people did not choose to vote on Proposition 53. Yet, they only count the yeses and the nos to add up to 100%. In Proposition 54, 7.7% didn't vote. In the recall question, this is the big reason why people came out to the polls. 4.6% of the people did not have a vote recorded. I'm not saying they didn't vote. I think that it wasn't recorded. And then when we came to the candidates, 8% of the people don't have a candidate chosen. So as I said earlier, remember this is what I call the residual vote rate. It's not I call it, but this is what's known as the residual vote rate. This residual vote rate is really huge. Normally it's between 3 and 5%. It's here, it's sort of like 8% if you add all this stuff together. So this is very, very large. So this is very fishy. Now, there were some places that didn't report any residual votes at all. Do we really believe that their machines are so accurate? Or is it in fact the case that they just didn't report it? As it turns out, you're not required to report your residual votes. So if you had you could have 20% residual votes. You could just say, here's my yeses and here's my nos, and that's the totals. So, strangely enough, these places that reported 0 votes not cast on the recall question, remember the recall question is the yes and no question, they all happen to be Diebold systems. Now, what's really interesting is that these vendors now go around and say how accurate their systems are based on the residual vote rate. Well, if you don't report the residual vote rate, of course it's going to look very accurate. So this is sort of ridiculous. So in any event, that's what was going on with this. So we have 3 counties that I don't really believe their data at all. It should have something there as a residual vote. But it doesn't explain, maybe their touch screens don't have a residual vote, but it doesn't explain the 0% absentee and optical scan residual vote rate. There was a poll that was taken by Edison Media and Mitofsky, and their exit polling indicated that 2.6% of the people who voted and then answered the polling question, they said that they did intentionally undervote. So that's still far lower than the 4%, the 8%, So what's actually going on here? We don't know. This is the explanation that Kevin Shelley gave Anthony Argyro when they wrote there were some emails written, and the Secretary of State said, if the county reports its total ballots cast as the sum of votes cast for all candidates or the yes-no proposition vote, the resulting ballots not cast number is 0. And no, the counties are not required to report under or over votes at all. Hence, the use of the residual vote rate in California and maybe in other states as a determination of system accuracy is entirely moot, not to mention bogus. So this is ridiculous. And now we're basing lawsuits on this, and we're buying millions of dollars worth of equipment based on this residual vote rate. I'm really cracking Paris up here. But that's actually what's going on. I mean, this is ludicrous, but that's actually what's going on. So now let's look at my data. This is the data that I was alluding to earlier. This is the key part of my talk. This is the data that's been misquoted all over the place. So take a look at this chart. Okay, here we have the recall question, which is the yes-no question. That's the leftmost 2 columns. Then we have the candidates question, which is the gubernator question. And then we have the average. Okay, now let's take a look at this. What do we see here? we see that in the recall question, the very, very best system appears to be the touch screen. Okay? It seems to be the touch screen with a 0.73 residual vote rate, the Diebold AccuVote TS. Okay? And the second best appears to be the ES&S Eagle with a 1.87, this is percentages, percent residual vote rate, number 2. And number 3 is the DataVote, that's the Chad sucking punch card, the DataVote punch card. So wait a second, I thought they said we were going to replace these with touchscreens because they were better. In fact, they're really not all that much better. And in fact, you can make optically scanned that's almost as good, and you can have punch cards that's almost as good. Now here it gets very interesting when we go over to the candidates. The Diebold, and by the way, Diebold publishes just that first column. We also have a number of people, Ted Selker from MIT, we have a member of the disabled community by the name of Jim Dixon, who go around giving out the first column from my data that I published. What the heck is going on here? They leave out the second column. The second column is the candidate's choice. Now we have the very, very best system, the Diebold AccuVote TS, turns out to be almost the worst system when it comes to the candidate selection. Wait a second. When they're choosing yes or no, it seems to not miss very many votes. When they're choosing the candidate, it loses almost 10% of the votes. What is going on here? This machine stinks. So, and that's exactly what my results say. For the results, and look at the ES&S Eagle. For the recall question, 1.87. For the candidates, it's 10.89. What the heck is going on here? In fact, as it turns out, if you look at the lowly DataVote Chad sucking punch card, it actually turns out pretty good. It's actually the second best system all over the place. And see, nobody ever breaks these out. Nobody breaks them out in terms of the different races that are being cast, in the different machines that are being done. This is the first of any sort of study that I know of that anybody's actually done that broke this out. And in fact, Henry Brady also did this, but did he do all of the data? It's not clear. He only published the recall yes-no data because, of course, that proved his point that, in fact, the hanging Chad is bad and the touchscreens are good. But did it prove that point at all? No. And in fact, that's what I told to the Associated Press. I told them, absolutely not. This did not prove that the touchscreens are in any significant way better than the optically scanned or the punch card. In fact, it really highly depends upon the type of machine that's being used and the manner in which it's been set up, the layout, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So that's what this data actually really shows. How did the Associated Press run this? They ran this article with the headline saying that the data revealed that the punch cards were bad. That is not what I told them as the results of my study. What I told them was that there really was no evidence that the punch cards were really any much worse than the touchscreens in any perceivable way. And in fact, all systems could be either good or bad depending on how they were set up. So it's a really fascinating thing that they ran this. I tried for a couple of days to get the Associated Press to retract that statement. They didn't, but what can you do? It's the press. So in any event, there was other issues related to this, but let me get to my conclusions because I am out of time, is that citizens, what this shows us is that citizens must demand full accountability in election data reporting at precinct, county, and state levels. This type of crap, this is what we're going to see in November, and to put it bluntly, it really is literally crap. This is not data that's being expressed in any good way, and it's being used and misused and abused in all sorts of ways. We need to independently audit this election data, and obviously not just by the Secretaries of State, because they're just turning in whatever sort of results they want based on this. You need to calculate the residual votes rates as a comparison of the number of voters who entered the polls, signed the polling book, and then supposedly tried to cast a ballot, as opposed to just the ones that actually got recorded by computers or whatnot. And then we should look at statistical outliers like we do in any other scientific endeavor, and we should direct that towards the cause. We should try to figure out what's the cause of these missing votes. The California recall data really confirms that the election data can be manipulated to make it appear that some systems have lower residual vote rates than others, and I believe that is actually what is going on, and my data proves that, and I hope that you all spread the word on that and let people know about it. I do have a challenge that is out, and at the end of the talks I will give details about that. But here's my information thing, and there is a handout about testing of voting equipment article from the New York Times. On the back of it is my challenge that I'm issuing at this conference and also at DEF CON. So I'm going to relinquish the microphone now to Bev Harris, who has done tremendous work in this field in ferreting out all this information, and she's going to speak, and then we'll answer questions, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenge that I'm issuing out. So, you ready? Thank you.
A lot of folks who've come charging forward lately, saying that they're the experts in the field, but I've been looking at this stuff real hard, and for my money, which I don't have any, she's the best one. If you think that was disturbing, I'm going to tell you some stuff that we're really finding, and I got to tell you, everybody needs to grab an oar and row, because we're in trouble. I didn't just write this book, Black Box Voting. What I did afterwards was I gave all the rights to the book and everything that I've made on this over to a nonprofit corporation, which I don't control, but I'm employed by. It's called Black Box Voting, and it's the first independent, publicly funded consumer protection organization for elections. And what we do is also has not been done before. We take voter concerns and complaints and go to that location and investigate and find out what the heck happened. One of the people who's done research with me who is just outstanding is Andy Stevenson. Andy, are you in here? Probably not. Probably getting breakfast. But at any rate, he and I, in the last month, have gone through 18 states, going and investigating specific things that happen. And I'd like to just give you a few minutes to see the state that we're really in. I've been called an alarmist, but I'm the person who's out on the front lines talking to election officials, poll workers, election judges, and voters. And what we're looking at is real. What we have is poorly designed software, which is inadequately tested, and they don't even use the tested version, that is implemented with inadequate procedures, which aren't followed. And afterward, everyone covers their ass. Let me give you examples from going to the places and looking. We've all talked about the software, but let's talk about the testing. Much of the testing now understand that in voting, you all vote at remote locations, the polling place, and it all comes into the mothership, the central tabulator, which takes all that data and adds it up. If you were going to tamper with an election, would you run around and tamper with 4,000 individual touchscreens, or would you go to the mothership? That's called the central tabulator. That's what we're most concerned about. The person who tests the central tabulator is from Cyber Labs, which is an independent testing authority. They call themselves an ITA. You constantly hear people say it's tested by this ITA, it must be okay. You ask questions, you find it boils down to one guy, Sean Southworth. Looks a little bit like Joey Buttafuoco. He's never given his resume to anyone. He doesn't say what he does. He has refused to answer the California Secretary of State and the New York Times. Shortly before the 4th of July, when his secretary was gone, Andy Stevenson and I walked in, got the first videotaped interview of Sean Southworth. We got a 1-hour interview in which his own words blow the socks off of any idea that we had the certification does anything worthwhile. Let me give you his answer to a specific question I had about certification of the central tabulator. I'll give you a couple. I said, Sean, you certified the Diebold software that, according to the SAIC report, had 326 security flaws, 328, 26 deemed critical security flaws. Were you just having a bad day? He said, I didn't certify that software. They tested something that I never looked at. Now, that's an absurd answer because that software had been used for years and his signature is on it. I said, how do you know what version they tested? It was redacted out of the report. He said, I don't know because I never saw the software. I said, well, how do you know you didn't test it? I didn't test it because they found flaws. Here's my favorite answer of all. Sean, in the central tabulator, why did you certify a system that allows large numbers of minus or negative votes to be inputted by the county registrar? He said, that's not relevant. I said, why isn't that relevant? Because the vendors don't like it if I put negative numbers on their report. Now that is foolish in two ways. One, it doesn't answer the question. And two, why is he caring about what the vendors have to say when he writes his report for certification? I asked him that. He said, well, if I don't write what the vendors like, they won't keep hiring me. He then said, I said, well, about these minus votes, and he says it's not relevant because I only test to the FEC standards, and if it's not in the standards, I don't write it up in my report. I said, well, in Florida, we had a so-called glitch where the ES&S touchscreens could not be manually audited, they really can't be anyway, because it scrambled the ID numbers. The software scrambled the ID numbers of the machines. Now that's equivalent in accounting to if you have 4,000 invoices and each one has a number and you're trying to match them up with the payment and it scrambled all the numbers. And he said, well, I don't test the scrambled ID numbers is not relevant because it's not in the FEC standards. I asked him about wireless communications. He said, wireless communications is not in the FEC standards. I don't test what's not in the FEC standards. So basically, the FEC standards can be used as a roadmap by anyone to say, as long as it's not in here, we just do that, and it will get through certification. They don't even use the official version. We know that now, all over the place. Every place we go, it's still happening. Inadequate processes. Yesterday, Andy Stevenson and I went to interview Scott Konopasek in San Bernardino County. We went there for two reasons. One is it's considered the most corrupt county in the United States. It had 13 individuals indicted for bribery in the last 4 years. And also because the county registrar referred to voters who wanted to watch the county of the vote as infiltrators and referred to what we do as a jihad. So I wanted to see what he had to say. But here's one thing he had to say in terms of procedure. I said, now we've got this mothership, the central tabulator. And he says, don't worry, I control access to it. I said, well, how many people accessed the central tabulator during the process of the election on March the 2nd? And he said, I don't really have that information. I said, well, could I do a public records request and get the names of the people who had access to the central tabulator while the election was live? And he said, no. The reason you can't is because I never wrote it down. I said, well, have you heard of such a thing as a key log? He said, no, we don't do that. And I said, can we do a public records request and you can write down what you remember of who was in there? He said, a public records request only applies to information that's already written down. We have a guy who's running a county that has 1 million voters that refuses to even keep track in a formal way of who had direct access, inside access, to the main tabulator for 1 million votes. That's what I mean when I say we're finding that procedures are inadequate. But the inadequate procedures aren't followed. We went to Arkansas because we were concerned about Prairie County, which according to the Secretary of State's website, for 6 weeks, it said in the primary election, which had about a 20% turnout, Prairie County had a 115% turnout. Nobody thought that they should explain that. So we talked to the state elections director. It's a different title, but that's the equivalent. Really great lady. And she's so frustrated. She says, well, first of all, they have 10 days to certify the election, each county. The election was held on May 18th. It was July 2nd before she was able to get the certifications in. She went to the state elections board and said, they're not even sending me their results. And they said, there's no penalty. The Prairie County person makes, I don't know, $40,000, $60,000 a year. Not a bad salary for a county that only has 4,000 voters. She submitted, the reason that the 100% turnout, 150% turnout, we sat there and we said, we're going to stay in this office until we get an answer from this woman as to what her numbers are. Well, she reported the wrong numbers for the official election. I mean, how much why are we paying someone $40 or $50 or $60,000, and we're going to do a public records request and find out how much we are paying this woman, who, by the way, had had the job for 10 years, and she sends the wrong numbers in to the Secretary of State. So when we say procedures aren't followed, I mean, they really aren't followed. We asked this kind, sweet woman how it is that we can get a better accounting of what goes on, and she said, well, a county registrar who can account for every vote isn't a real popular person in Arkansas. Afterwards, you see all these problems come out, and the cover your ass mode is amazing. You as computer people need to get to the press and tell them when they put a ridiculous response in there. In Alabama, in the June election, they had some votes come in, and then a week later, 300 more votes showed up. They said they had been stuck in the modem. Now, I wonder what the sound is of a vote coming out of a modem, you know. Is that what it sounds when it tumbles out of the modem a week late? It'd been in there, just stuck. So I suppose if we have missing or residual votes, we should look in modems. You as computer professionals are not going to be able to solve the immensity and the breadth of this problem all by yourselves. You got to grab an oar and row at what you can do best using your common sense. But we do need to think of a couple things. We need to retain public policy, which makes our government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We can never have a situation where we have just computer professionals who are telling us how our voting system is going to work. If Andy's 84-year-old mother can't understand how it works, it's not good public policy. There's no reason we have to make it complex and change everything so that only a few people can understand it. We need to work with accountants, not just computer scientists. I've been saying this for a while, and the reason is because accountants are used to seeing how to prevent fraud. They work with procedural stuff. Let me give you an example of why this is so important. Recently, we had a computer scientist of great fame in the voting issue explain why there could be a possibly good reason to have a double set of books, which actually it's a triple set of books that's in the GEMS Diebold Central Tabulator. Well, there could be a good computer reason, but there is never a good accounting reason. And the reason is because the first thing an auditor who has an accounting background will look for when they're looking for fraud is a double set of books. You can't have it because it's used to manipulate. You know, there's certain things that you want to take out for procedural reasons because they're so frequently used to manipulate. But because there hasn't been enough input from the accounting profession, we're going along reinventing the wheel. Accounting is not just money. You use accountants to count the points for Miss America. Accountants set up checks and balances for the lottery. What they do is deal with counting and checks and balances to make it hard to cheat. The other reason that we can't just depend on the computer profession is because of human factors that I consistently see are not taken into account. For example, we're computerizing the voter registration system into new statewide computer databases. Nice idea, lots of advantages. Human factor. In Everett, Washington, the Diebold printing plant, they put the entire voter registration database in an 056 file, which also included 1.4 million Social Security numbers, on a laptop, which was then stolen by a temporary employee. If that was sold on the black market, that would be identity theft for 1.4 million people, because some company hired a temp who stole a laptop. Human factors. That's the kind of reason we need to bring lots of people from different backgrounds in when we're designing a system. Human factors. Absentee and optical scan ballots. San Diego was not permitted to use its flawed touchscreen machine, and so they all are going to absentee ballots, or they're going to optical scan ballots, I should say. Well, guess what? It's all Diebold optical scans, and I know I need to quit. But the printing plant is going to have a strike, or maybe will, only has the capacity to print 4 million. They need to come up to 12 million. And they've let go half their staff now. And they don't know how they're going to print all those ballots, so there may be a meltdown because we went to paper. So we need to bring in a few more people, I think, and start to create what we want. And then from there on, we can fix it. I'm going to end it here because I know we're running out of time.